My wife smiled while placing the divorce papers on the kitchen table and calmly said, I finally found the life I deserve. You spent 12 years chasing impossible dreams while Richard gave me everything you never could: private jets, luxury vacations, designer clothes, and a future that actually means something. I looked at her without saying a word, because after everything we had survived together, I never imagined our marriage would end with a conversation about money. She picked up her suitcase, adjusted the diamond earrings I had bought for our 10th anniversary, and walked toward the front door. Just before leaving, she turned around and laughed, saying, maybe in another life you will become successful enough to deserve someone like me. Then she stepped outside and climbed into a brand new black Rolls Royce waiting in front of our house. I watched the car disappear down the street without trying to stop her, because deep inside I knew something she did not. My name is Ethan Walker, and this is the story of how the woman who abandoned me for a billionaire stood crying outside my office 5 years later, begging for another chance. When I first met Olivia, neither of us had anything. We lived in a tiny apartment above an old grocery store, where the walls were so thin we could hear our neighbors arguing every night. We shared one second-hand car and counted every dollar before buying groceries. Even then I believed my life was perfect, because every morning I woke up beside the woman I thought would stay with me forever. I worked as a software engineer during the day and spent every night building a business that almost everyone believed would fail. My dream was simple. I wanted to create technology that helped small businesses compete with giant corporations. Investors rejected me, friends laughed at my presentations, and relatives constantly told me to stop wasting my life on impossible ideas. Only Olivia seemed to believe in me, at least that was what I thought. For years I worked 16 hours every single day. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations, and family gatherings, because every spare minute went into building my company. I promised Olivia that one day all the sacrifices would be worth it. She always smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, I will wait as long as it takes. Those words gave me strength whenever I wanted to quit. Everything changed during the worst year of my life. Our largest investor suddenly withdrew his funding. 2 major clients canceled their contracts on the same week, and the bank refused to extend our credit line. Within 1 month, my company lost almost everything. News websites called us another failed startup, and people online mocked my dream. I remember driving home one rainy evening wondering how I was going to tell Olivia that we might lose our house. When I finally walked through the front door, she did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I had eaten. She looked directly at me and asked one question: how much money do we have left? I answered honestly, maybe enough for 3 months if we stop spending on unnecessary things. She nodded silently and walked upstairs without saying another word. That was the night something inside our marriage quietly broke. Over the following weeks, Olivia became distant. She spent more time shopping, meeting new friends, attending expensive parties, and posting glamorous photographs online. She stopped asking about my company completely. Whenever I tried talking about my problems, she changed the subject or looked at her phone as if my words no longer mattered. I convinced myself she was simply stressed because I loved her too much to imagine anything else. One Friday evening, I finished work earlier than expected and decided to surprise her with dinner. I bought her favorite flowers and drove home smiling for the first time in weeks. When I opened the front door, the house was empty. Her car was gone. I called her twice, but she never answered. An hour later, I received a text saying she was having dinner with friends and would be home late. I believed her because trust was something I had never questioned. The next morning, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. There was no name, no greeting, and no explanation. Only one sentence: if you Want to know where your wife really goes every Friday night? Drive to the Grand Imperial Hotel at 7:30 tonight. Attached to the email was a blurry photograph of Olivia entering the hotel beside a man wearing an expensive suit. My heart started racing. I stared at the image, hoping it had been edited or taken years earlier, but the timestamp showed it had been captured only 6 days before. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to believe someone was trying to destroy my marriage, yet something deep inside me whispered that my entire life was about to change forever, and I had no idea that what I was about to discover would hurt far more than losing every dollar I had ever earned. My hands were shaking the entire drive to the Grand Imperial Hotel. I kept telling myself the anonymous email had to be fake because Olivia would never betray me. After everything we had been through, I arrived 20 minutes early and parked across the street where I could clearly see the main entrance. Every minute felt like an hour, and every car that stopped made my heart race. Then at exactly 7:28 a white luxury Bentley pulled into the entrance. A tall man stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. An employee immediately opened the passenger door and Olivia climbed out, smiling brighter than I had seen in months. She laughed as the man placed his hand gently on her back, and together they walked inside the hotel like they had done it many times before. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I wanted to run inside and demand an explanation, but something stopped me. I needed the truth, not another argument. I quietly entered the hotel a few minutes later. Not another argument. I quietly entered the hotel a few minutes later and found a seat in the restaurant overlooking the private dining area. From where I sat, I could see them clearly. They were laughing, sharing expensive wine, and holding hands. Across the table, Olivia looked happier than she had looked with me in years. Every smile felt like another knife pushed into my heart. About 30 minutes later, the man reached into his pocket and handed her a small velvet box. She opened it and gasped. Inside was a diamond bracelet worth more money than I had earned in an entire year. Olivia immediately stood up, hugged him, and kissed him in front of everyone around them. I lowered my head because I could no longer watch the woman who once promised to stand beside me through every hardship, had traded 12 years of marriage for luxury gifts and expensive dinners. I quietly left the hotel before they noticed me and drove aimlessly through the city until after midnight. I finally parked near a quiet lake where Olivia and I had shared our very first date. Years earlier, we had promised that no amount of money would ever change who we were. That promise now felt like it belonged to two completely different people. The following morning, Olivia returned home acting as if nothing had happened. She asked whether I wanted coffee and casually talked about shopping with friends. I looked into her eyes, searching for even the smallest sign of guilt, but there was nothing. She lied so naturally that it frightened me more than the betrayal itself. I simply nodded and pretended everything was normal because I wanted to know how far the lies really went. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly gathered information. Every Friday, she visited the same hotel. Every Tuesday afternoon, she met the same man for lunch. Every Sunday, she claimed to visit her mother but instead spent hours inside a luxury penthouse downtown. I never confronted her because each new discovery answered another question I had been afraid to ask. One evening, while Olivia was taking a shower, her phone lit up with a message. The screen displayed only a few words, but they changed everything. Richard had written, "My lawyer finished the agreement soon. You will never have to worry about Ethan again." My blood turned cold. Agreement? What agreement? I quickly placed the phone back exactly where it had been before she walked out of the bathroom. The next day, I hired a private investigator named Sarah Mitchell. She had spent 20 years working financial fraud cases before opening her own agency after. Listening carefully, she quietly said something I will never forget. She said, "People who betray their spouses for money rarely stop with one lie. If she is planning something bigger, we will find it." 10 days later, Sarah called asking me to meet her. Immediately, she placed a thick folder on the table and slowly pushed it toward me. Inside were photographs, hotel records, financial documents, and copies of private emails. Richard Collins was not only a billionaire businessman, he was also secretly moving company money into offshore accounts, and federal investigators had already begun watching him. Olivia knew everything. She had even signed confidentiality agreements promising to stay silent until after my divorce was finalized. Then Sarah opened the final page and quietly said, "Ethan, this is the part you need to prepare yourself for, because according to these documents, your wife is not planning to leave after the divorce. She is planning to help Richard take something that belongs to you, and once she succeeds, neither of them intends to let you ever recover." Sarah slowly closed the folder and looked directly into my eyes. She said, "Richard Collins never entered your wife's life by accident. He spent months learning everything about your company because he believed your software could become extremely valuable if he gained control before the market realized its true potential." I stared at her without speaking, because none of it made sense. My company was barely surviving. Investors had already abandoned us, and the media had declared us another failed startup. Sarah quietly placed another document in front of me and pointed to a single paragraph hidden inside. "One of your unfinished patents is technology that several multinational corporations have been trying to develop for years. Richard discovered its true value before anyone else, and instead of buying your company legally, he decided it would be much cheaper to destroy your marriage, force you into bankruptcy, and acquire everything after you collapsed." My heart started racing as every piece of the puzzle finally came together. Olivia had never been interested in Richard because of love. She had become part of a plan that started months before I even realized my company was in danger. Every expensive dinner, every weekend trip, every secret meeting had been carefully arranged to break me emotionally, while investors lost confidence in my business. Sarah handed me a flash drive and said, "Everything you need is inside. Emails, voice recordings, financial transfers, hotel security footage, and signed agreements." We copied everything legally before they realized anyone was watching. I took the drive without saying a word, because I finally understood that this was no longer just a broken marriage. It had become a criminal conspiracy. That night, I returned home and acted exactly as I always had. Olivia smiled while preparing dinner and asked whether my meeting with investors had gone well. I smiled back and answered, "Better than expected." She never suspected I already knew every lie she had told for the past several months. I watched her carefully and realized something that surprised even me. I no longer felt angry. I felt calm, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I had the truth. 3 days later, Richard announced the biggest technology conference of the year, where he planned to reveal a massive acquisition that would supposedly change the future of artificial intelligence. Every major news network planned to broadcast the event live. My invitation arrived the following morning. Even though my company was struggling, I had still been invited because my name remained connected to one of the conference panels. Sarah looked at the invitation and smiled. "This is exactly what we needed." Over the next week, my legal team quietly worked behind the scenes. Federal investigators continued gathering evidence while my patent attorneys finalized paperwork that had been delayed for months. Unknown to Richard, my technology had officially received full patent protection only 48 hours before the conference. That single approval changed everything, because nobody could legally purchase or use my invention without my permission. The morning of the conference, thousands of business leaders filled the convention center. Reporters crowded around the entrance, waiting for billionaires, celebrities, and famous entrepreneurs. Richard arrived first, surrounded by cameras. Olivia stepped out of the limousine, wearing an expensive, white designer dress proudly. Smiling beside him, she looked directly at the reporters, as if she already owned the future. I arrived 20 minutes later, driving the same old sedan I had owned for years. Several people looked at me with sympathy, believing I was only there to watch my company disappear. They had no idea that everything was about to change. The main presentation began exactly at 10 o'clock. Richard confidently walked onto the stage while giant screens displayed his company logo. Behind him appeared the words, "The future begins today." He smiled at the audience and proudly announced that before the day ended, he would acquire revolutionary software capable of transforming businesses across the world. Olivia sat in the front row, applauding louder than anyone else. Then Richard reached for the final contract that would make him the legal owner of my company. He smiled confidently and looked toward the audience, completely unaware that only seconds later the largest screen inside the convention hall would suddenly go black, and a new video would begin playing, a video containing every private meeting, every secret conversation, every financial transfer, and every promise that he and Olivia believed nobody else would ever see. The giant screen suddenly turned black and every conversation inside the convention hall stopped. Within seconds, the first video appeared, showing Richard Collins secretly meeting with Olivia inside the Grand Imperial Hotel. The audience watched in complete silence as hidden security footage displayed every dinner, every expensive gift, and every private conversation they believed nobody would ever see. Richard's confident smile disappeared almost instantly. Olivia stood from her chair in panic, looking around the room as reporters quickly pointed their cameras toward the stage. The second recording began playing. It showed Richard speaking with his chief financial officer inside a private office. He laughed while explaining that once Ethan Walker lost his company, there would be nothing left to stop them from purchasing every patent for almost nothing. Then his voice became even colder as he said, "People always underestimate desperate men. They never realize they are signing away their future until it already belongs to someone else." The room became completely silent because every word was now echoing through hundreds of speakers. Federal investigators who had been waiting outside entered the convention center, accompanied by financial crime officers and corporate fraud specialists. They walked directly toward the stage while television cameras captured every second live. Richard tried to leave through a side exit, but two agents stopped him before he reached the door. Olivia's face turned completely pale as another recording appeared on the giant screen. This time it showed her signing confidentiality agreements, accepting expensive gifts, and discussing the divorce timeline while promising Richard that Ethan would never suspect anything until it was too late. Reporters immediately surrounded the investigators, asking whether the evidence was real. One senior federal officer calmly answered that the investigation had been ongoing for several months, and today's presentation confirmed every major allegation involving corporate fraud, insider trading, conspiracy, and financial manipulation. The audience could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Only minutes earlier, Richard Collins had been introduced as one of the most successful businessmen in America. Now he stood surrounded by investigators, while handcuffs were placed around his wrists. Olivia began crying and repeatedly insisted she had only followed Richard's instructions. She claimed she never understood the full plan and believed everything was legal. Nobody inside the convention hall believed her because every signed document, every recorded conversation, and every financial transfer proved she had knowingly participated. From the beginning, she slowly turned toward me, hoping I would defend her the way I always had during our marriage. I simply looked back, without saying a single word, because there was nothing left to defend. As Richard was escorted toward the exit, one reporter suddenly asked a question that echoed across the entire hall. "Mr. Walker, after everything these people have done to you, what will you do now?" Every camera immediately turned toward me. I walked onto the stage, picked up the microphone, and quietly answered, "Revenge was never my goal. I only wanted the truth, because truth always survives longer than lies." The audience remained silent before hundreds of people slowly began applauding. Just as the applause ended, my attorney approached, carrying a sealed envelope. He smiled and whispered that the United States Patent Office had officially completed the final international approval. Only moments earlier, every global right to my technology now belonged exclusively to my company. Several multinational corporations were already waiting inside a private conference room, hoping to negotiate licensing agreements worth billions of dollars. The company everyone believed had failed only weeks earlier had suddenly become one of the most valuable technology businesses in the world. While Richard was driven away by federal agents and Olivia stood crying beside the empty stage, my legal team quietly escorted me into the private conference room, where executives from the world's largest technology companies were already waiting to begin negotiations. None of them wanted to discuss my divorce. None of them cared about the scandal. They only wanted one thing: the technology that everyone else had underestimated for far too long. The negotiations lasted almost 8 hours. Every company inside that room wanted exclusive rights to my technology, but I refused to sell it completely, because I had spent more than a decade building something I truly believed could change the future. Instead, I offered licensing agreements that allowed every partner to use the software while my company kept full ownership. By the time the final contract was signed, Walker Technologies had secured more than $9 billion in long-term agreements, making it one of the fastest growing technology companies in America. News spread across the world within hours. Every major television network reported that the small startup everyone had declared dead had become a global technology leader. My photograph appeared on business magazines, newspapers, financial websites, and eventually on the cover of Forbes, with the headline, "The man who refused to quit." Friends who had ignored my phone calls for years suddenly wanted to reconnect. Former investors apologized for doubting me. People who once laughed at my dream now claimed they had always believed in my vision. Several months later, my company opened a new headquarters overlooking the New York skyline. Thousands of employees worked there, creating products that helped millions of businesses around the world. Every Friday, I personally welcomed new employees because I never wanted anyone to forget that every successful company begins with ordinary people willing to work through extraordinary difficulties. One rainy afternoon, my assistant entered my office and quietly said, "There is someone outside asking to see you." She looks like she has been waiting for hours. I walked toward the reception area and immediately recognized Olivia. She looked completely different. The designer clothes were gone, the expensive jewelry had disappeared, and the confidence she once carried had been replaced by regret. She slowly stood up, holding a small envelope in her hands. She looked into my eyes and whispered, "I made the biggest mistake of my life. I thought money was everything. I believed Richard would give me happiness, but he destroyed every part of my life. I lost my friends, my reputation, my career, and the only person who ever truly loved me." She placed the envelope on my desk. Inside was the old wedding photograph we had taken 12 years earlier. She had kept it through everything. Tears filled her eyes as she quietly asked if there was any chance we could start over. I remained silent for several moments because part of me remembered the young woman who once believed in impossible dreams, but another part remembered the woman who walked away the moment life became difficult. I finally smiled gently and answered, I forgave you a long time ago because carrying hate only hurts the person holding it, but forgiveness does not mean returning to the past. Some doors close forever so better ones can finally open. She nodded slowly, understanding that my decision would never change. Before leaving, she thanked me for treating her with kindness even after everything she had done. Then she quietly walked away without looking back. This time it was not anger that ended our story, it was acceptance. A year later, I stood on the stage of an international entrepreneurship conference, speaking to more than 10,000 young business owners from around the world. One student asked me what the greatest lesson of my life had been. I smiled and answered, never allow another person's opinion to become the limit of your future. The people who leave when life becomes difficult are making room for the people who will celebrate with you when success finally arrives. Build your dreams with patience, protect your character more than your money, and remember that real wealth is not measured by what you own but by the kind of person you become while earning it. The audience stood and applauded for several minutes. As I walked away from the stage, I looked toward the city lights outside the window and quietly thanked the younger version of myself who refused to quit when everyone else had already given up. Because if I had surrendered on the day my wife walked away, I would never have discovered that the greatest success of my life was not becoming a billionaire, it was becoming a man whose character could never again be bought by anyone.